welcome to Housmans Bookshop. Happy birthday, Emma Goldman. Yeah. Thanks very much for coming out very last minute for this. We didn't know how many would be turning up. We originally had another book scheduled for tonight, and it hadn't actually been printed yet. And then last Thursday, Karen Ross mentioned something about Emma Goldman's birthday being today, so I thought, well, why don't we just use the slot and take it from there? And I wouldn't have forgiven myself if we didn't do it either. So, welcome to Housmans Bookshop, one of the oldest radical bookshop. It's the oldest radical bookshop in London and one of the few remaining radical bookshops in the UK. This place has been, it's about time somebody did a history of this shop because it's been involved in so many radical causes in the past. So if you're going to be buying your books from Emma, buy them from us or Freedom, not Amazon. I'm going to hand you on to Donnacha DeLong. Donnacha DeLong has got a long and notorious record. Amongst other things, he was a past president of the National Union of Journalists. He's an online consultant for media and various other things. So, pass you on to Donnacha.
Thank you. So, a little bit of background, which was in the description. I wrote my dissertation when I did a master's in political communication on the Anarchist Analysis of Emma Goldman and Rudolf. The inspiration from that was my Marxist lecturer, who just kept citing Marxist theories and didn't mention Rocker or Goldman, and I spent the whole time putting my hand up and going, but Emma Goldman wrote something about that before the person you've mentioned. It didn't go down particularly well, but after resubmitting and passing, I got my MA. So when the suggestion came up, I've basically gone through the dissertation, pulled some bits out, and just to make sure that everyone knows who I'm talking about and everyone's up on it, I've also kind of written a bit of a biography rattling through the key points in her life. I'm sure even if you've read all of Living My Life from cover to cover, you'll have forgotten some of this, because even I realised I'd forgotten quite a bit when I was writing it up. So hopefully that's interesting. Then I've got a little bit kind of analysing particularly Goldman's gender politics and gender analysis, and a little bit put it in context of some of the arguments that are still going on today about intersectionality and identity politics. So to start with, it's not my revolution if I can't dance to it. That's probably the most famous Emma Goldman phrase that she never actually said. It's a paraphrase of a really interesting part in her autobiography. So she writes, "At the dances I was one of the most untiring and gayest. One evening a cousin of Sasha, a young boy, took me aside. With a grave face, as if he were about to announce the death of a dear comrade, he whispered to me that it did not behoove an agitator to dance. Certainly not with such reckless abandon, anyway. It was undignified for one who was on the way to become a force in the anarchist movement. My frivolity would only hurt the cause. I grew furious at the impudent interference of the boy. I told him to mind his own business. I was tired of having the cause constantly thrown into my face. I did not believe that a cause which stood for a beautiful ideal, for anarchism, for release and freedom from conventions and prejudice, should demand the denial of life and joy. I insisted that our cause could not expect me to become a nun, and that the movement should not be turned into a cloister. If it meant that, I did not want it. I want freedom, the right to self-expression, everyone's right to beautiful, radiant things. Anarchism meant that to me, and I would live it in spite of the whole world. Prisons, persecution, everything. Yes, even in spite of the condemnation of my own comrades, I would live my beautiful ideal." So that pretty much sums up Emma Goldman's politics. So then to look through her life and where some of this came from, to go right back to the very beginning, she was born in the Russian imperial city of Kovno, which is now Kaunas in Lithuania, in 1869. Her mother, Tobe, had married the love of her life at age 15. They had 2 daughters, but she was left widowed. She then married Abraham Goldman. The marriage was a deeply unhappy one, and Emma describes him as being somebody in a permanent rage. Tobe withdrew into herself and became inaccessible to everybody in the family. Abraham was also a very bad businessman, and some money that Tobe had brought into the marriage was basically lost, as he set up business after business that failed. That didn't improve his mood. The family moved constantly from Kovno to Königsberg, which is now Kaliningrad, onto St. Petersburg. The birth of the couple's first child, Emma, did nothing to improve Abraham's views either, because he was hoping his firstborn would be a boy. He used violence as a method of control, often whipping Emma. Conflict with her father dominated her young life, with neither backing down. So the beginnings of the revolutionist, even when she was a young child, refusing to back down to her father's violence. But one of the things she particularly begged to be allowed to do was to go to school, and her father relented, and she was sent to primary school in Königsberg. While she was there, she showed exactly the same attitude in relation to her more abusive teachers, clashing with teachers who hit children too much, some abusive teachers that she came up with who were sexually abusing some of the pupils, she also stood up to. Ultimately, she passed her exams when she reached age 12, but the school refused to give her the personal reference that would allow her entry into secondary school. Her religion teacher called her a terrible child who would grow into a worse woman. And I suppose from the religion teacher's point of view, she was bang on. That was the end of her schooling. Her father was very, very happy to take her out of school and sent her to work in a glove factory, age 13. At the same time, she remained an absolutely voracious reader and started to begin her own revolutionary education. In particular, she read the utopian novel What Is to Be Done, which had inspired many, many a Russian radical since it was written in 1863. As she approached 16, her father decided that she should be married. Emma objected violently, begging to be returned to school. Her father responded, "All a Jewish girl need know is how to make gefilte fish, cut noodles fine, and give her husband babies." Emma refused to accept this and changed tack a little bit and decided she should instead be allowed to emigrate to America with her beloved sister Helena. Her older half-sister Lena already lived in New York with her own family, so there was somebody to go to. Her father said no initially, but Emma threatened to throw herself off a wall and kill herself if she wasn't let go, and her father, actually realizing he was better off with her out of the house, let them go. They, as many immigrants to America experienced, they went off with absolutely high hopes of the land of gold and freedom. They were arriving in the United States. That wasn't what happened. Of course, capitalism was far more developed in tooth and nail in America at this point. And Emma and Helena found, as poor Jewish immigrants, they could only find work in the sweatshops of Rochester, New York, which were run by other Jews who had only arrived in the country a number of years before. And this is something that taught her a very serious lesson, was that hierarchy is hierarchy no matter who it is, and people will often find themselves given some bit of power, using that power against other people. Her parents then followed the two girls within a year, worsening her situation, and she found herself particularly lonely in her work life or at home. She only had Helena to talk to. So when she was approached by a young man, Joseph Kirshner, who went on walks with her and was particularly nice, and he offered to marry her, she agreed. She then found that he was morbidly depressed and unable to have sex. And if you know anything about her later life, that was an unforgivable sin. She left him and filed for divorce. Her family were completely scandalized and convinced her to go back. So she did. She went back to him. They married again, and it lasted a couple of months this time before she left, and this time she didn't even bother filing for divorce. She had begun to attend radical political meetings outside of work and found herself instinctively drawn to the anarchists. In 1887, the hanging of the May Day martyrs in Chicago, anarchist August Spies, Albert Parsons, George Engel, and Adolf Fischer, and the suicide... Is that cracking a bit?
Yeah, can give you another one. Just have another one just behind it.
Test it.
And the suicide in custody of another, Louis Ling, was the catalyst that lit the revolutionary fire in young Emma Goldman. Her source of information about what was going on in Chicago was Die Freiheit, which was a German language paper edited by the militant anarchist Johann Most. A fight with a relative in her father's home over Emma's clearly distraught state over reading about the executions led to a fight with this relative. She threw a glass of water in her face and pretty much ended her relationship with all of her family except for her sister Helena. With a sewing machine under one arm and $5 in her pocket, she made her way to the offices of Die Freiheit in New York City. Within an hour of arriving in Saks Cafe on the Lower East Side, where the magazine had directed her, and it was the main hangout of New York anarchists, she met Alexander Sasha Berkman, the man who was to become a constant figure for pretty much the rest of her life. That evening she heard Johann Most himself speaking and became his apprentice and very likely his lover. A lecture tour followed, and gradually as she was working her way through, she started to ignore what Johann had told her to do and started to depend more on her own personal style. This started to lead to Johann moving away from her. He wasn't very happy. This young woman was deciding to do things her own way and not listening to what the great German anarchist was saying. So she started spending more time with Sasha Berkman, and they ultimately became lovers. They also planned and carried out their most infamous act. The strike and lockout of the Carnegie Steel plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania, was one of the most violent and militant strikes of the period. On the 6th of July, 1892, a shootout between members of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency and the strikers left 9 strikers and 7 guards dead. Goldman and Berkman decided to organise an attempt on the life of the plant manager Henry Frick in retaliation for hiring the Pinkertons. They tried to make a bomb and failed. Instead, it was decided that Sasha would attack him with a gun and a knife, and Emma would stay behind and she would tell the story to the world.
Sasha managed to get up to him, shot him 3 times and stabbed him once, but Frick survived. Which was somewhat fortunate for Sasha because he was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 14 years, whereas if he had successfully killed Frick, he would have been executed. Goldman's former mentor, Most, who was very likely at this point of Sasha replacing him in Emma's affections, became probably the most prominent critic of...
It seems like your batteries are going weak, so let's just sort it out.
Let's try it without the mic.
You're better off that moving. Trust me there. I've done this before. Just talk noises.
That's better. So Most became probably the most prominent person within the movement, criticising them for their action. He described it as childish immaturity. Emma decided to turn up to one of his talks to see if he'd repeat this phrase. He did, so Emma jumped up with the horsewhip in her hand, slapped him across the face with it, then snapped the horsewhip in 2 parts and threw it at him. And that was the end of her relationship with Johann Most. Around this time, her reputation started to build up, and the name Red Emma became attached to her by the media, who were absolutely obsessed with pretty much everything she did. Some of her speeches were quoted verbatim in the newspapers. She was starting to become an anarchist celebrity. She was imprisoned for incitement to riot, for telling unemployed people that if they didn't have bread to go ahead and steal it. But the moment she was released, she walked out of the prison gates and gave exactly the same speech again in front of the prison to the assembled media and thousands of followers who turned up to support her. At this point, she'd realized she had made it. She was probably, at this point, the most prominent anarchist speaker in America. While she was in prison, though, she'd worked as a nurse's aide in the infirmary. On her exit, she found out that her new lover, Ed Brady, was starting to become irritated with her celebrity and her constant activism that was taking her away from home. And she discovered that actually what he wanted her to do was settle down and start to have a family, which was really not on her agenda. Ed came up with a very cunning plan. He decided he would fund her to go to Vienna to study for a degree in nursing and midwifery. The plan backfired hugely for Ed, because not only did Emma take to the studies as she had always wanted to do, she expanded her studies, discovered Nietzsche and Freud, but also Vienna at the time was an absolute maelstrom of political ideas. Virtually every major political idea that in the 20th century was starting to be developed there. Everything from the good to the very, very bad. Some of the origins of Nazism, of course, were in Austria, including Hitler himself. But into this maelstrom, she absolutely threw herself, gobbling up new ideas and everything. And by the time she came home, via London, where she met Kropotkin for the first time and got to talk to him and take on board some of his ideas, she went back to America an absolutely committed and solid anarchist, and Ed was shown the door. In the coming years, she crisscrossed the country, giving talks and becoming involved in numerous campaigns: free speech, women's suffrage, birth control, anti-war, and gay rights. And one of the most amazing things about how she did that was when she was doing things on free speech, she then brought some of the people who'd come along with her to some of the other things, and she was an amazing coalition builder. So you found the situation over the years that you had right-wing free speech activists campaigning on behalf of wobbly hobos who'd been imprisoned somewhere in the country for giving a speech. And similarly, when she was doing some of her birth control campaigns, she had some of the most unlikely supporters in that, because she helped to get this idea that a principle was a principle regardless of who it was. And some very, very conservative and liberal people supported very radical causes when they were shown that it was a freedom of speech issue. Her writings then on all of these issues became a very important part of anarchist thinking from that point forward, and broadened the scope of the movement, which had been very narrowly focused on class war and revolution and criticism of the state, into a much greater focus on issues of individual freedom. In 1901, let's see if I can get this right, Leon Sol... No, I can't. Czolgosz, who was a mentally unbalanced anarchist, assassinated President William McKinley after he attended an Emma Goldman talk. Now, one of the things about this is Emma reported that actually he'd been stalking her before he went off and attacked the president. But despite this and her own concerns about the man, she was arrested and held for over 2 weeks, suspected of involvement in the assassination. They ultimately realized that she had no involvement at all and let her out. In 1903, she launched the Free Speech League to contest the deportation of anarchists under the Anarchist Exclusion Act, which had been passed after the McKinley murder. The formation of the Industrial Workers of the World in 1905 gave them a new target. As I mentioned, the street tub thumpers that worked for the union were often arrested for simply standing on street corners and preaching. In 1906, she launched Mother Earth magazine. Sasha, when he was finally released from prison, became its editor until 1915. The magazine brought together a virtual who's who of the American radicalism in those years, not just anarchists, but radical trade unionists and other radical thinkers and artists. In 1916, Emma and Sasha founded the No Conscription League. A year later, the suppression of anti-war activism in the US became absolutely extreme as the US entered the war. The entire 165-strong leadership of the Industrial Workers of the World was arrested. Bill Hayward, who was probably the most prominent figure, was sentenced to 20 years for interfering with the draft. America's most prominent socialist, Eugene Debs, was sentenced to 10 years for simply criticizing the Espionage Act. Many, many others were arrested and imprisoned as the US went to war not only with Germany, but also with its own left-wing movement. And sadly, ultimately put an end to the mass left-wing movement in the US. We can see the results of that today. In June 1917, Emma and Sasha were arrested and charged with conspiring to obstruct the draft as well, which they blatantly were doing. By 1919, as they finished their sentences, both were deported to Russia, along with 246 other anarchists and communists. In Russia, Goldman and Berkman tried to work with the Lenin government, but ultimately became disillusioned with the increasing totalitarianism of the Bolshevik state. They escaped the country, afraid that if they had actually even tried to ask for permission to leave, they would be imprisoned like many of their Russian comrades. Goldman wrote the damning critique, My Disillusionment in Russia, and Berkman wrote the equally damning The Bolshevik Myth. They spent some time as basically as stateless refugees, being kicked out of one country in Europe after another until they settled in London. And at the time, London was a place where you could actually settle if you were a political refugee. And Emma focused on writing her autobiography. One of the problems they faced was very much, even if the anarchist left, was still fairly sympathetic to what was going on in Russia, and they were seen as traitors for having written their exposés of it. And that took a number of years to die down. She continued then to tour Europe, and she was able to go back and tour America when the ban was lifted in 1934. In 1936, she was plunged into despair when Sasha Berkman, who was suffering from terminal cancer, committed suicide. Her friends conspired to give her something to distract her from this because they were afraid she might go the same way. And the civil war in Spain was something that would provide her with that distraction. Goldman travelled to Catalonia 3 times after 1936. She observed the civil war, documented both the successes of the CNT revolution and, as time went on, the attacks upon it by the Stalinists and then by Franco's forces. The documentation was published as this book, Vision on Fire, which also includes her correspondence with Rudolf Rocker and Millie Witkopf. Now, Rocker and Witkopf are particularly relevant to where we are now because a couple of decades previous to that, they had organized the Jewish trade union that carried out a massive strike in 1912 and pretty much ended the sweatshop situation here. Rudolf was then interned as an enemy alien for being suspected of being in league with the Kaiser, who he'd been given refugee status in Britain to escape, and was returned from 2 years and ultimately deported, and Millie had gone with them. They spent some time in Germany building the anti-fascist alliance and anti-Nazi alliance. Obviously were ultimately unsuccessful, and they fled then and went as far away as they could and got to America.
Somewhere along this route, Emma and Rudolf and Millie all met up and got to know each other. To be honest, it's not a major fact. It's somewhere in Living My Life, which is a 2-volume book. I didn't have time to go through and find out when they first met, but the Vision on Fire is full of letters back and forth to each other, and also contains a nice bit of humour and shows how well they knew each other. Because in 1937, having spent some time in Spain, she wanted Rocker to write a book on anarcho-syndicalism, recognising that he was probably the world's greatest expert on it. Rudolf, getting a bit old at this point and wasn't that keen on doing it, so she wrote to him and said, "I wish you were here, believe me, I would spank you." Millie then wrote back and said she'd make sure he did it, and he did. The book, Anarcho-Syndicalism Theory and Practice, which was published in 1938, became Rocker's most popular book. It's a book that's still in print today and has been published into numerous languages. The defeat, however, the revolution crushed her. She threw herself into raising money to help Spanish refugees, and given the worsening situation, she decided the only place she could go was Canada to try and raise money. Sadly, she died in Toronto in 1940, age 70, of 2 strokes. But the slightly nice thing is the first stroke that she had that pretty much ended was while she was sitting with some friends playing cards, and in the middle of being given a hand she didn't like, she keeled over, and that was her. So that's her life. Potshots, there's a hell of a lot more. Her autobiography is probably the most complete of any I have ever read. She goes through week by week who she met, what she did. So it's an amazing book if you can make your way through it, because it really gives you a picture of the entire political scene in America in the 20-30 years she was active, and is covered in the book. So now I'll move a little bit on to the analysis of what really she brought to the movement and what lessons we can draw from that for politics today. So her really lasting influence on anarchism and radical movements in general was to introduce a level of gender awareness and a critical view of the women's rights movement of her time. Before this, and a very good example of that is Kropotkin's Memoirs of a Revolutionist. He doesn't even mention getting married in the book. I think his wife is mentioned once towards the end, but he hasn't actually mentioned when he got married. So gender politics just didn't come into it. Bakunin was slightly different. He was a strong supporter of his sister's work to do it, but really in the mainstream of the movement, it was all about revolution tomorrow. And the very interesting thing about Goldman and Rocker as well is they came to a realization, different to the people who came before them, that the revolution probably wasn't coming tomorrow. They could see what was happening, they could see the right going to have the anarchist revolution tomorrow really wasn't happening, and it was clear to them probably back into the 1910s, 1920s. So they adopted a much more gradualist approach. They had a look and looked at what was oppressing people, what problems they had, and decided they would put their efforts into, hopefully, inspiring people to take more action based around their own issues. So Rocker, particularly with the trade union movement and then the anti-fascist movement in Germany, brought people again together and started to introduce them to radical politics through focusing on their issues. Goldman's work in gender politics is the thing where she helped to radicalize a great number of people. So I'll go through some of the ideas that she had and some of the criticisms she had. So she proposed absolute sexual freedom and campaigned for access to birth control and condemned marriage as antagonistic to love. She wrote, "Marriage is primarily an economic arrangement, an insurance pact. It differs from the ordinary life assurance agreement only in that it is more binding, more exacting. Its returns are insignificantly small compared to the investment." She regarded marriage as the root of attempts to control women, to limit their sexuality, to make them dependent on their husbands and prevent them standing for themselves and for their rights. She compared the effects of capitalism on men with the effects of marriage on women, arguing that both were paternalistic arrangements. She wrote, "The institution of marriage makes a parasite of women, an absolute dependent. It incapacitates her for life's struggle, annihilates her social consciousness, paralyzes her imagination, and then imposes its gracious protection, which is in reality a snare, a travesty on human character." She referred to marriage as the only safety valve against the pernicious sex awakening of women, arguing that marriage turned women into a machine for the production of children to preserve the race. She argued that the high birth rate of children born into unhappy marriages created the policeman and the jailer. Instead, she wrote, women wanted fewer and healthier children in relationships based on love and free choice, rather than the compulsion imposed by marriage. Now bear in mind, she had been working as a nurse and a midwife for a while, so a lot of this was based on conversations she had with the very, very unhappy women in the poorer parts of New York where she was working. As early as 1900, she began to include issues such as birth control in her public activism. She identified the uncontrolled birth rate amongst the poor as a contributor to the continuing poverty, ill health, and subjugation of women, but disagreed with other activists on the issue of whether birth control was the only panacea for social ills. She recognized its importance as an issue, but argued that it was not the most vital issue. And this is something that led to her split with Margaret Sanger, who had previously been somebody who'd worked with her on this, and Sanger decided to effectively junk principle and lump in with the eugenicists to try and achieve her single aim. And when you read some of the things that Sanger said, it's very hard to tell whether she was serious or not, or was just currying favour with the eugenicists, but some of them are truly appalling. Goldman, on the other hand, was absolutely focused on the health of the women she'd been working with as a midwife. She was arrested a number of times for distributing birth control information, and in one trial in 1916, she said that she was proud to be considered a criminal if it was a crime to work for healthy motherhood and healthy child life. She also faced hostility from her anarchist comrades as she began to include issues such as homosexuality in her activities, which many on the movement saw as unnatural. The social pressures on anarchists, who were already regarded as depraved, led them to fear association with other issues. Goldman countered that she did not see anarchism as a mere theory for a distant future. It was the living influence to free us from inhibitions, internal no less than external, and from the destructive barriers that separate man from man. She regarded the prohibition and persecution of homosexuals as a social wrong and a moral prejudice. And she had tried to meet Oscar Wilde when she was in London and he wasn't around, and she ultimately then met him when he went to the States when he was doing his cowboy tour of America. And it had, for a very long time, you can see in the book that she had wanted to meet him and talk to him. And of course, people might not be aware, if they haven't read his more political writings, that he was a great friend of Kropotkin and was an anarchist himself. She was a strong advocate of free love in her own life as well, and that's what she was saying, and she had a string of lovers, some of them who had a better effect on her than others, but she never allowed herself to be restricted by what other people thought. She described it as the strongest and deepest element of all life, the harbinger of hope, of joy, of ecstasy, of love, the defier of all laws, of all conventions, love the freest, the most powerful moulder of human destiny. She referred to marriage as a poor little weed produced by the state and the church. She also, at the time, the women's suffrage movement in the US was starting to get active and campaigning for votes for women. She actually condemned as a fetish the focus on suffrage as the primary target of activism by some of the organizations, arguing as an anarchist that suffrage was an evil that enslaved people, and that political history shows that men received nothing from that route that they could not have gained more directly with less cost and greater durability. She also recognized how social pressures had impacted on the suffragette movement in the States, arguing that they had faced criticism that claimed that they were promoting lust and sin and disregarding society, religion, and morality. Rather than counter these claims by promoting freedom, she argued that the exponents of women's rights at the time were indignant at this misrepresentation, and that they humorlessly sought to show that this was inaccurate, as they were the exact opposite. They argued that it was women's slavery, their subjugation by men, that prevented them being good and pure, and that free and independent women would purify the institutions of society. Goldman argued that while they were breaking old social restrictions, they were creating new ones, and condemned what she saw as a narrow vision based in Puritanism that sought to exclude men from their emotional life due to a generalized negative view of men's character. Instead, she argued that women's freedom and men's freedom are closely allied. She argued that if the partial emancipation of women achieved by the suffragettes were to become full emancipation of women, it would need to do with what she called the absurd notion of the dualism of the sexes. From her anarchist point of view, she did not regard emancipation to be simply women's achievement of equality with men in a society still dominated by capitalism and the state. On the contrary, she regarded that as turning them into wage earners who would have the equal rights of men to face exploitation, theft, and the freedom to go on strike and face starvation. Goldman identified Puritanism as one of the reasons for the oppressive social character of US society. She argued that Puritanism denounced the deepest feelings of men and women as vile and sinful. She placed the ideas of Puritanism at the root of social repression, the demand for marriage, high birth rates, regardless of the health of the mother, and a ban on birth control. She argued that its power over society was due to the fact that it was at the foundation of the state and the legal system in the United States, which led to the legal repression of ideas, desires, and individual conduct in the United States at the time. And what's particularly interesting about this is these arguments and these analyses were at the absolute beginnings of the women's movement in the 1960s, when the second wave feminism started. I've spoken to a couple of people who were involved in Berkeley about this, and it was reading Emma Goldman's work that really inspired them to create a new wave that wasn't just focused on the vote, but was focused on something else. Sadly, from an anarchist point of view, they then decided that the structures of Marxism suited them better and moved away towards Marxism from the anarchist beginnings. So, I think a quote that really brings all this together is that the solution of the economic evil can be brought about only through the consideration of every phase of life, the individual and the internal alongside the collective and external. Emma Goldman's early life and her experiences as a Jewish woman, as a prisoner, and as a nurse and midwife taught her that oppression has many different forms and impacts on different people in different ways. Her essay, Patriotism, a Menace to Liberty, written in 1917, analyzes the way that a range of economic, political, and social and educational institutions, in particular schools, are essential to creating the patriotic and warlike mindsets that were essential to the state at that time, particularly in America. This predates Gramsci's analysis of hegemony by a decade and Foucault's very similar analysis 50 years later. And anyone who reads Foucault will note that he stopped referencing his ideas around the 1850s and didn't reference anyone that clearly influenced him after that. And I think there's a very clear hidden Emma Goldman in Foucault's work. But today we call that intersectionality, the recognition that different people bring different issues to the table, and how it's important to recognize and to take those into account in any group's activities. This can be as absolutely simple as remembering to hold your meetings in an accessible space if you want disabled people to take part. Hold them upstairs and a wheelchair user can't attend. That is intersectionality brought right down to the very, very basics. It is that simple. It's demonized by some people as something that's big and scary and horrible, but actually that's what it is. Too many people still complain, like they did to Emma when she was talking about gay rights, about identity politics, as it being distraction from class politics, as if people who come along can simply forget about what they've learned through their ethnicity and their culture, about how oppression impacts on them and how all the different ways that people can be oppressed. I think in the 1990s, the politics of convergence and the slogan "Many yeses, one no" understood this implicitly. In celebrating a century and a half since the birth of the incomparable Emma Goldman, it behooves us to recapture that spirit and recognise that a woman fighting sexism, a gay man fighting homophobia, a trans person fighting discrimination, a black woman fighting racism are all part of the same battle against oppression and violence. In conclusion, intersectionality is to do it the way that Emma Goldman did it. Recognise these issues, fight for oppressed people, and bring together people in solidarity to fight for others as well as themselves. Telling people to leave their identity at the door is telling them effectively they can't dance to this revolution.
Oh, that's a good one.
Well, Donnacha, I thought you paid a blinder there. I really do. Especially in reference to Foucault, that should be quoted somewhere. And is there any questions from the audience? Anybody got any particular burning questions or issues regarding Emma or Donnacha's take on her?
Go for it.
Thanks for the talk. It was really, really enlightening. As you were speaking and you were talking about sexual rights, the rights to critique marriage, sort of the rights to kind of liberate eros, if you like, I couldn't stop thinking about the affinities between her way of thinking and some of the writings of Herbert Marcuse, for example, where it's from, people like that. I just wondered whether, if you knew of any writers who had drawn those connections.
Well, actually, the main person is Goldman herself. If you read through, so there's some of it in this, which is about drama, and there's quite a lot of it in this. But the other book is the collection either of the works from Mother Earth or the specific collection of her works from Mother Earth. I recognise some of those names from things. She used a wide range. She was incredibly well read, and she used a really wide range of thinkers that informed some of her analysis. So I'd start with her, have a look through that, and then you'll probably find actually most of the things that you're looking for in that.
Oh, okay. Do I really need them?
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Believe me.
Okay, thanks. As you were speaking, I found myself thinking about Mary Wollstonecraft, as you do, and I was kind of wondering, since Emma Goldman left such a detailed record of her life and the works that inspired her as well, and she read, is there any evidence did she ever comment on Mary Wollstonecraft's work?
I can't completely. It's been quite a while since I've read the original work, so as I said, this was drawn fairly hurriedly from my dissertation. But I did remove a paragraph about Wollstonecraft that was in the longer analysis that I had in the dissertation. I don't remember if there was a reference attached to that, but I'm sure, there is no doubt that Godwin and Wollstonecraft were, recognised by everyone at that point as being antecedents of the movement. So the definitely, and Shelley as well, and she was a huge fan of drama and poetry, and she definitely would have been aware of Shelley. So there's probably stuff, I just can't remember specifically if she wrote about her, but I think it's very obviously there. Also, Voltairine de Cleyre, her politics, again, I don't remember if she mentions her, but it's very, very clear that Wollstonecraft was a huge influence on her. She adopted the ideas of Wollstonecraft about living separately much more than Goldman did. Goldman liked to shag a lot, whereas Voltairine didn't. She wanted to live separately on her own, and she, some of the arguments between the two of them are very interesting, and not exactly what you'd expect from major political thinkers. They did call each other some very nasty names. But Voltairine was clearly very influenced by work in Wollstonecraft. I just don't remember if she mentioned it, but I think she did. There's a new collection of her writings, came out on AK Press only a couple of months ago.
Oh, please do. You go.
Hi, I wanted to say thank you for putting together such a wonderful talk at the last minute, because I saw it all go off on Twitter. You literally got invited like 2 days ago or something, and like that was absolutely magnificent. I feel like I know thousands times more about Emma Goldman now. I've got a bit of a question about sort of your concluding ideas on intersectionality and identity politics. And like personally, I'm all for intersectionality, like 100%, but I think that identity politics can be something slightly different, and there's certainly some really problematic forms of identity politics that are about sort of, instead of anarchist being about sort of the free expression of one's own desire, they're very much about forming a counter-hegemony with which to counter the oppression, and then almost defining oneself by one's oppression, if you see what I mean. And sometimes I've read books that are like this, and they're pretty awful. They're like sort of pretty much about sort of blaming individual men for patriarchy and things like that. And I just wondered if you had anything to say about that, because I think when you concluded, you treated sort of identity politics and intersectionality as almost synonymous.
No, and I wouldn't say that. I'd say I think too much hostility to what is defined as identity politics is me asking people to leave their identity on the door and come forward. So it's not about those who criticise specific examples of identity politics where it becomes too extreme, and Goldman did the same herself. So the people who were exclusively focused on suffrage, she disagreed with. The people who were exclusively focused on birth control, she disagreed with. I think it's about getting a balance in there and using intersectionality to try and make sure that it doesn't go one way or the other. There are those in the movement who also say, it's all about class, stop talking about gender, stop talking about sexuality, stop talking. That's what I'm talking about. So yes, you get extremes everywhere. There are people who become completely locked into their own view and see their world as their own, and everyone needs to fit into their world. But I think it's about what Goldman managed to do, which is work with people on their locus of oppression and then bring them with you into something else. I do think we were pretty good at doing that in the 90s. You know, the slogan of many yeses, one no, that, you know, reclaim the streets with Liverpool Dockers. There were so many convergences at that point where people didn't say, you need to do things the way we do it, or you can bugger off. We went, right, we're all doing something, bring everything to the table, we'll discuss it. If we don't agree, that's fine. Mutual association, that's the basic principle. I think that's the way we should look at it, is see whether we can build solidarity around different issues. And I see what you're saying, but I think the attitude has been wrong on both sides, which has allowed things to be fractured. So you get Deepak, who would love as much solidarity as possible, doing things on their own. And the police find it very easy to stop people who are in wheelchairs. And I've seen them. You don't need to kettle them. You just need to block off the accessible bit. The more people who can support them and then bring them along to something else. And as I said, making sure what you're doing is accessible so they can come along. I've listened to many people from Deepak saying they would really like to be involved in other things, but if you're a wheelchair user and the meeting's upstairs, forget about it. So I think it's about that. It's about using intersectionality to get around what you're saying, where people end up in silos and get stuck in silos.
I mean, I think I'd agree with everything you were saying, apart from I don't think things like birth control or being in a wheelchair are about identity. I mean, there's like identity means a sort of identifying with a kind of hegemonic image or role or something, whereas I'd see sort of these things about being about people's structural position or something, or that their oppression, not their...
I think you will find some people who would argue, I wouldn't, that birth control is about women just fighting for things that are important to women. Obviously, that's bonkers and ridiculous, but it has. I'm sure there are people here who have been dismissed when they want to talk about so-called women's issues in general meetings where brocialists and anarchists just go, that's not important because it's not about class.
Yeah.
And that's my point. So yeah, obviously they're not identity politics, but they are things that are defined by some as being exclusive.
I just want, first of all, thank you so much for the cracking talk. But what would you say were her greatest disappointments? What were the things that she felt let down by the rest of the anarchist movement? What did she feel like she missed out on doing? Those two things in particular.
I suppose her own writing, her own stuff, the point where she was most disappointed was the point after she escaped Russia and found a complete collapse of solidarity, because too many people were still seeing the Russian Revolution as what they wanted to be, rather than listening to people who'd been there and had to sneak out of the country because it was so dangerous to them. I think that was probably her biggest disappointment. Or presume also Johann Most slagging them off, but she got her own back on him. So there were lots in that. I think in life in general, the point she died in 1940, that must have been an horrific time to die if you had been hoping for a free world. That was the world pretty much at its worst. The Nazis were in power, the fascists were in power, it looked like they could crush. Hitler hadn't yet made the stupid and ultimately destructive option to invade Russia. That was the point where it looked like they might conquer everywhere, and she'd been and watched it happen in Spain. So I think just as a life disappointment, at the very end of her life, it was probably the worst period she'd gone through.
And what would you tell young people who have never came across anarchism before? What would be the 2 or 3 points that you'd say that are absolutely critical that they could then use as thinking tools for their own activism?
I'd start and ask them how they feel about the government, how they feel about the police, how they feel about how school is organised, and then listen to them and then point out to them where there are people and writings that they might want to read that, even though they're 100 years old, might absolutely speak to them. There was a very interesting on Channel 4, must have been around 10 years ago, where they had young Muslim radicals reading what Jewish radicals had written 100 years previously, and suddenly they were realizing that actually what they were thinking wasn't new, what they were trying to do, and absolutely surprised to see it coming from a quarter they didn't expect it at all. And it was a really good, so I'd be more, I live in Tottenham. I can hear people on the bus speaking what I would call proto-anarchism. They hate the police, hate the government, hate their teachers, but it's not connected to anything yet. It hasn't been brought in, and it's about plugging that into a very rich selection of people writing about stuff over 150 years or so that will speak to them.
Fantastic.
I'll get it back to you. Thanks.
This is working.
Oh yeah. Going back to when did Emma Goldman meet Rudolf Rocker? I think they probably met in 1907 because there was an anarchist congress in Amsterdam and they were both there. So I guess it must go back to at least 1907. The previous anarchist congress, which tried to meet in 1900, she was also present there, and she wanted to speak on gender issues, and the French syndicalist movement actually forbade a public meeting on those issues. The French syndicalist movement, the CGT at the time, was not in any way progressive on gender issues, and at the time I think women needed permission to join a union or get a job, so the times moved on from then. But I think there's a word that's perhaps missing in your discussion, and that's the word syndicalism, and how Emma Goldman looked at syndicalism, how syndicalism sort of meant it's actually an alternative to trade unionism. So actually in 1920-21, you have the development of a syndicalist international, and Rudolf Rocker was actually the leading force in that. He wasn't just an anti-Nazi or an anti-fascist. I mean, he was a prime mover in the development of a small international with a membership of 1.5 million or so members. And that wasn't a hugely successful. Fascism did defeat the syndicalist movement that developed after the First World War. But there are dimensions of sort of trying to build a broad movement. The German syndicalists had a syndicalist women's league, so it was very much part of their activity. And Rocker was married to
not married.
Partner
with Millie Bitcoff.
and another sister, Bitcoff, was a partner of an anarchist living in London who was...
Yeah, that was Rose with...
Thank you.
I'll just say it's incredibly ironic, and it's a pity you weren't at my talk last week, which was on the Great Unrest and the beginnings of the syndicalists in these islands. And an interesting corollary to that about women being excluded was what Jim Larkin did in Ireland. Within the workers, they weren't willing to accept women being in the transport union, the ITGWU, so he worked with his sister Delia to set up a women's union so that they could fight on an equal basis, and that became a big part of trade unionism in Ireland. And I think in Ireland, trade union membership is probably even more gender unbalanced than here in terms of more women are members of unions in Ireland than men. Here in the public sector, it's around 60% women, 40% men. Private sector, well, it's a lot smaller, but I think in Ireland it has consistently been the women workers who've been members.
So the discussion that you had earlier about class politics and identity politics, probably because I listened to it as I was looking at you, reminded me of a time 10 years ago when we were having those discussions all the time that you remember very well. And since then, and Donnacha and I were both involved in the Anarchist Conference of 2009, where there was a bit of an issue in that collective, in that working group, getting identity politics recognised, and since then I've been thinking about how actually that separation of identity politics and class politics is in itself a fallacy, just because, for lots of reasons, but if for no other reason than there's a huge amount of identity involved in class politics, and working class is an identity as much as an actual state of being, and we encounter that all the time, but because we're supposed to keep class and identity politics separate, then we can't talk about it, and we can't talk about the practical, the day-to-day implications of that, and also the political implications of that. So I would say this is probably the least articulate thing that any anarchist could say about class and identity politics, but this is what I tend to say all the time now when I'm confronted with that, because to me it just takes the argument apart. And not to say that it's not something that should be discussed, but we should discuss it from a different point of view, rather than just say, no, it's either this or it's that, or, you know, we need to join these two things together. It's like, can we just be somewhere else and look at this from a point of view where actually it's not really a thing?
But I don't have anything to add to that.
I tell you, one of the previous talks we had Carl Levy here, and he also referenced different anarchist movements in developing countries, you know, from a century ago, places like Egypt and things like that. And one of the things that, I just bring this because it's just another part that sort of adding another dimension to what's been said. There's some interesting stuff being done by researchers finding out details of anarchism, well, depending on how to say anarchism. I'm more informed by American anarchism, so I use the term anarchist of colour. There is some really fascinating stuff that's coming out by researchers about anarchists in other parts of the world. There's APT Atachari that's been that Ollie Burke-Larson's championing just now, and he's found tons of records from a few different places, and I think he's going to be doing this research for years. I'm seeing young black and Indian anarchists who want to organise stuff, but they're just too geographically isolated in the UK to actually do anything in their own local area. You've also got Benjamin Zephaniah. You know, we have to have him doing a talk here sometime as well. So I'm really, and although the anarchists aren't at any other stage where, you know, anarchy was such a potent force a century ago, I'm still quite hopeful about that there's a lot of interesting things going on. And I just think that there can be so many new dimensions open up, even though things are so grim at the moment. Does anybody have any questions or remarks or anything like that? I wish I'd said that better, actually.
Actually, I'll just add one more point, because I think it's something that we miss out, and the point I was making about Foucault, just basically ripping Emma Goldman off blatantly, is there's a lot of interesting stuff being done in that space by people using the tools of post-structuralism, postmodernism. We had that nonsense about post-anarchism around the time I was writing the dissertation, and my point on that is that the word post is completely unnecessary because it is anarchism. The way I describe Foucault is Foucault's a depressed anarchist. His analysis is anarchist, but he went through 68 and lost all hope he could build another world. So there is no prescription, but the analysis is basically an anarchist one. And I think we need to look at how all of that gets pulled back together. That one of the things, and maybe people like Saul Newman and David Graeber and others can do that, to bring that academic research back down to the level where it's useful to people. Too much of academia is just up there for academic journals, and there's really interesting stuff being written about, being talked about, but it's written for journals that you have to pay a huge amount to access unless you're a student. It's not distributed widely, but things are starting to change that. There's open publishing, there's all of this, and it's starting to come out of it, but we need more public academic action and public information coming out, because if you're getting the funding to go and do the research, share the bloody research more widely than just the students who happen to be studying that topic. Get it out there, and yeah, there are lots of interesting strands coming out in lots of spaces. It's not just about Mexico, and it's not just about northern Syria. It's a lot of places there's interesting strands that should and could inspire us.
I absolutely agree with you about post-anarchism stuff. The only reason I use the term post-anarchism myself is because a lot of my own anarchism is influenced unintentionally by continental philosophy, and although I come to a similar place, my coordinates are just a wee bit different, and I don't want people to fall into trap. I'm thinking from exactly the same, come from exactly the same point, but I absolutely agree.
Well, I'll just say, Saul Newman completely ignores Emma Goldman and Rudolf Rocker. Just completely, because it totally disrupts his argument if you include them. Yeah. So he just uses Kropotkin and Bruton and Bakunin and critiques them for not being flexible, not taking all of these things into account. And I'm going, yeah, but Emma Goldman did. Yeah. And if you just ignore all of the facts, you can make any argument you like.
Yeah. Anybody?
Go for it. So don't realise that. Do apologise.
Thank you for the talk, by the way. Why do you think black people don't engage with the anarchist movement? Is it because there are no people that look like them leading the way?
I think.
And was Emma Goldman, was she a black feminist? Does she include black women in her critique of oppression?
Why in the contemporary structures, one of the big problems was, up to a couple of years ago, Christmas for Anarchists was the Anarchist Book Fair, and it always happened to be on the same weekend as the March for Victims of Police Violence, which meant that there were lots of people on that march who just got really, really annoyed with the Anarchist conference, the Anarchist Book Fair, about continually having it on the same day, and there was a spat between the organising groups, and unfortunately it was something that wasn't resolved before the book fair was closed down. You're right, at the last Anarchist Book Fair I was looking around and I think I saw one black person. It was in Tottenham. It was ridiculous. I'm not sure. I do think we need to talk more. One of the problems is the anarchist movement in the UK is at a very, very low ebb. Compared to where we were in the 90s, or Claim the Streets was going on when there were mass demonstrations, even the student movement. I think a large part of the movement did itself no favours by being overly critical of UK Uncut and Occupy. Instead of engaging critically, it did just stood back and criticised. And as a result, a lot of young people who should have come into the movement and re-energised it just went, well, fuck you, we'll support Corbyn instead. And I think the big thing is actually anarchism is not about the movements that are talking about anarchism. Anarchism is about what people actually think on the ground and how they deal with the oppression on themselves. It's from them, not the organised groups that have been knocking around for 100 years, that the movement is going to come, as it did with the students, as it did with Reclaim the Streets originally. It wasn't the existing groups that kicked all of that off. The existing groups either joined it or ignored it and criticised it. So I think the thing is that anarchism, it doesn't belong to people who call themselves anarchists. It's a fairly natural thing when you realise you hate the police, hate the government, hate your bosses, and want to do something together to change your situation. And I think we need a new thread to come out of that, something that's not about standing on a bridge and hoping to be arrested, which in the most recent grassroots movements decided is their main tactic is to be arrested, but actually is interested in fighting back and starts to draw together different strands together in solidarity. As to whether Emma Goldman was particularly involved in black politics, the reason there are black activists mentioned in her diary, it wasn't something that directly drew her in. And herself and Lucy Parsons had a difficult relationship. Emma Goldman and other prominent women often tended to get into writing very nasty things about each other. But she did, in terms of what they worked on together, the IWW particularly was open to all and was very strong on trying to bring black workers into the movement because of Lucy Parsons' influence, and Emma Goldman was fully on board with that. And I'm assuming that her work as a nurse and a midwife would have brought her to people in lots of different communities together, and her argument about birth control, unlike the eugenicists afterwards who managed to throw racism into it, her argument was about defending the health of all of the women she worked with, whether Jewish, whether black, any of the other groups of women who were absolutely trapped in where they were without access to birth control and being driven into ill health by having child after child after child after child after child, and that was a priority for her, and it applied across the board.
Right. I think there are problems in anarchism. I think one of the problems sometimes is that it doesn't necessarily confront imperialism. And I think in Mother Earth, there's one particular example where Emma Goldman published a contribution from a New Zealand writer who was defending a sort of white-only policy in relation to New Zealand or Australia. And I think that was shameful. And I guess she just wasn't very well informed. I think there are times when syndicalists and anarchists have seen themselves as progressive, and because they're progressive and modern, they're in advance of other people. There are also elements that are actually very critical of that. So if you read Bakunin, you can find passages where he talks about civilization and he criticises the rights of German imperialists to take over bits of the world, or Americans to massacre Indians, or British people to take over India. So they're progressive criticisms in relation to imperialism. But those criticisms aren't necessarily always taken on board by all anarchists, so I think that's a problem. Interestingly, I was just thinking of Ba Chin, who's a Chinese writer, and she writes very passionately about the treatment of women in Chinese culture, and takes on board an anarchist perspective coming from Bakunin and Kramer.
You said Ba Chin, or you said she, so there's two very similarly named people in China. Sorry, I just want to get clear in my own mind. You say Pa Chen.
I believe so, yeah.
Ba Chin.
I believe so.
Whose name is pseudonym is derived from the first syllable of.
Yeah.
But he was male, yeah.
Yeah, he was male.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Right. Yeah. You inadvertently referred to him as she just then.
Okay. He writes a book called The Family.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful sort of critique of patriarchy in Chinese society.
Yeah.
So how then can anarchism, what kind of toolkit can they offer the black struggle? Because I gave birth to an anarchist just because she's born into a world that is going to oppress her just by her existence. So what toolkits can you offer black people who are anarchists without even realising they are to overcome all the oppressions that's, you know, put on us? I mean, it's nice to talk philosophically, intellectually, academically, but we're living it now, and we need to change something now, even if it's just one thing.
For a very strong black perspective on it, I'd start with the writings of Mummy Abu Jamal from prison. Some of the other Panthers in America, some of them have very, very powerful things to say, having gone through the Black Panthers and flirting with Maoism and Marxism, and have come to anarchism at the end. So there is a strand, particularly in America, of black anarchism that has come through the struggles of the Panthers and everything that was associated with that. And there's videos online. There was a talk at the Anarchist Book Fair 5 years ago by 2 former Panthers. So for something, for a young black kid wanting to learn about anarchism and wants to see himself reflected in the screen, I would recommend. Well, there we go. Just look up. There's so much stuff on YouTube. If you just search Black Anarchism, there's quite a lot of stuff up there. As I said, Mummy Abu Jamal. Fingers crossed. Looks like it might be possible he will finally be released from prison, ironically under a Trump government. But
can I? To be honest, I think there's been so many, particularly anarchists under 50. Well, no, that's not fair at all. I honestly think that it's never been more hopeful within anarchist such spaces for black activists to get involved. And maybe I'm being falsely optimistic. I don't think so. That I think they're more open to these ideas than ever before. And it's just a case of younger black anarchists just getting together a wee bit. And I honestly believe they'll get a lot of support from a lot of sources. There was a black anarchist who was involved in the shop for many years, but and I wanted him to get involved in this project, but now he's in a very responsible job where if he's known that he's an anarchist, it's going to do his career tremendous harm. So maybe whenever he quits it, whatever job it is, and maybe he sticks it to man or what have you. But
he's got to get Johnson in first.
Yeah, absolutely. But so I'm honest, and I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, we had a young black anarchist, a Tamil anarchist from Manchester, and I was urging him to start something because you will be surprised at how much support you will actually get. Honestly, it's never, the time has never been better. I promise you. I know you look sceptical, but
Well, I think my point is.
Go on, please do.
My point is that we have to create our own groups. My point is, what's existing that we can use? You know, what are the mentors within the anarchist movement that can come and support us and show us what to do? You know, anarchist doesn't have to look like revolutionary trying to bring down everything. They can look pretty in pink. My point is, what are the toolkits? And we have to change the narrative and also change how we practice anarchy. So what is the toolkits that you guys have, is what I'm talking about.
Well, I think each anarchist will tell you a different thing, but I mean, Emma Goldman, Rudolf Rocker, all that, I would love it if you did a talk on Rudolf Rocker. I don't want to ambush you, but I really, really would love it if you did. But one of my favourites is Colin Ward, and it shows you a way of existing in society without and still doing anarchist practice in spite of everything. And some anarchists don't like him because he's a quiet, modest man, but some very insurgent ideas in him. Now he's a white bloke, but that doesn't mean he wasn't. He's for me, Colin Ward, and the thing is, his writing is beautiful and it's very accessible. He did short pieces and he did long pieces, and I think that's where I would start with anybody. And he's got a lot of stuff about children and play in his work as well, and education. You can't go wrong with, in my view, you can't go wrong with Colin Ward.
Thanks. Sorry everyone for speaking for the third time. I feel like I'm being really mouthy tonight. I'm remembering a conversation that I had with a bunch of people at the London Action Resource Centre a few months ago. And that's a place in Whitechapel that is not squatted. It was actually it was a building that was bought collectively by some people from Reclaim the Streets over 20 years ago and renovated and runs as not a social centre, but exactly what it says in the name, a resource centre. So it's a building that people can get involved in and use for things that they would like to do, whether they're meetings or fundraisers, or to physically make prop for things that they for action want to do, and everybody who uses the building is also involved in running the building, and sometimes in practice that is less smooth than I've just said it, but yeah, that's what the building is there for, and actually it's been there for about 20 years, which is amazing. But there's this kind of conversation that happens in cycles. It's just like, why do most of the people who are regularly involved in this building look a bit the same? And which is not always the case, actually, because it's not that. I think if we say, oh, everybody's white in this space, or everybody's white in this movement, we also erase the people who are there and are very active and are really not white. And I want to be able to reflect how uniform the movement is without erasing the people who are there and contributing and doing really great things, because there is that as well. But and we were talking specifically about that building, and that building is not a social centre, like I said. It's a place that everybody who uses it is also involved in running, and how that can be quite strange for a lot of people. And it was strange to me when I first started going there, and it took me a while to get the hang of it, to understand. And I think what happens in the anarchist movement, maybe in this country, maybe in the city, I don't get about very much, so I don't really know very much about outside of London. But it's that there are formats that are more familiar to some people than others, and that's because of the way we all live in different communities and the different types of interactions that we're used to. And so I don't know whether what happens as well is that some things in the movement that are really basic for certain people aren't basic for other people, and so that it can be strange to turn up at a building and the building is not there for you, the building is there for you to get involved in. And it's yes, so that can be odd, but at the same time that is also a form of actually a revolution taking place as we do stuff as opposed to, no, we're not doing this because at some point we'll bring about social change. Every single time we are participating in running this building that we're also using, this is a bit of a revolution. And again, it's this idea of, the revolution is not something that's going to happen at some point in the future. The revolution needs to be happening now to bring about social change, as opposed to the idea of social change bringing about the revolution. And I don't know if I've said something really trite or really profound there. I have no idea. But yeah, so I think it's also about the kind of lack of familiarity with certain things for people who are from some backgrounds rather than other backgrounds, and that I think goes through and beyond things like race and class and nationality, and whether we're migrants and whether we're second generation migrants or first generation or third generation or whatever, or whether we are disabled or not. If there's a prevalence of certain things that we find unfamiliar in a movement, then we're less likely to get involved in it.
Can I just borrow that before I pass it on to you? I mean, the person that's just been speaking is part of a small collective that run a fantastic film club in Lark every month, and I have to tell you that they've done they've shown more cutting-edge post-colonial films and what have you than nearly any film club I've known, and they really are some of the hottest things I've seen. They're linked to the Association of Black Humanists, and they're doing a fantastic event very soon. So I would urge you to speak to her immediately after this, because I think you will find there's a lot. I think she'll be able to allay some of your concerns.
Yeah, thank you. It's more of a comment than anything else, really. When I have these talks, I think this gentleman did a talk a few months ago. What really is very impressive about people like Goldman is They just get up and go.
Mm.
Just get up, there's no jet engine, no Facebook, just get up, go and do it. And there may be a clue there. Who knows? But that's extraordinary. Without any money, don't know what's going to be in front of you, don't go and find a revolutionary, learn one about it, go down to Spain, do some more, get thrown out, get on the road. For that time, when men were mostly in charge, I guess, not an awful lot of money, it's very brave and very inspirational and quite remarkable, as I say, when the jet engine didn't exist.
Mm.
And I think for all of these, whenever we have these talks, that's the one thing that always blows me away, is that there are some people that just get up and go, and there's a big lesson, I think.
What clue?
That sometimes you just got to do it yourself.
Absolutely. But seriously, speak to Arnell afterwards. I really would urge you to do so. Anyone for any more? Oh, sorry, Donnacha, do you want to say something quick?
Well, just probably the idiot with the most books in the room. Maybe if you're not acquainted with the volume that's still in print, called African Anarchism. Maybe you know it already, do you? Whereas so that one springs to mind, and I've just checked. It's available online for free as well. And your question sort of reminded me of one of the very early books, well, in the post-war period, with the title Stateless Societies. I think it may have been Evans Pritchard, I should know, but it's not my field, I should know offhand, but I used to have a copy of it. And I think, if you was following more in the sense that he was editing it, or Anarchy magazine devoted to Africa, indeed that particular issue probably may have even been brought to mind, may contain stuff about that volume, Stateless Societies. What that indicates is the extent to which on the ground, until probably the influence of colonialism, okay, there were empires and all the rest of it, no shortage of them, but in out-of-the-way areas, which would be, in a sense, the bulk of the African continent, the societies were stateless. You know, so, okay, it's an academic volume, but examination of that by people who are interested, I think, would be a basis for deriving sort of confidence, the fact that there's a basis for saying that on the African continent, statelessness prevailed as much as anywhere, and certainly more than in Europe for a longer period.
Thanks very much, Dr. Donnacha. Any more? Dave? You're almost quiet. You're looking very thoughtful.
No, I was just wondering about Oscar Wilde's cowboys.
Yeah, it was a kind of celebrity around the time, obviously without TV and radio only beginning. One of the main sources of information were these random tours of famous people, and the cowboys were a big part of that. So, you had cowboy tricksters and did everything. And Oscar Wilde went, and there were pictures of him wearing a cowboy hat, and he toured America as a cowboy. It was as the controversy was starting to come out, but before he was charged with homosexuality, so it was an open secret at that point, and I think he got very quickly out of Britain to try and escape, but obviously when he came back, and it ended so sadly. But yeah, fascinating. His actual life, people kind of see some of the things he's written and think he was of that group, but he wasn't really. He was satirizing very, very heavily. And then you turn to some of his children's work, like The Selfish Giant is a communist story. It's about big bullies dominating space and how actually you need to beat them and get access to the space for everyone. So that political strand comes through, but then you read his later stuff, De Profundis and Soul of a Man Under Socialism, and that's it. That was when he was depressed and had lost everything, and he just let his true politics out. And without a doubt, he was a huge admirer of Kropotkin's.
Any more for any more? No concluding remarks?
Well, actually, just on the imperialism point, I've just finished a book about Captain Jack White, and Captain Jack White was a very, very interesting character. He's one of the only really prominent Irish anarchists. He was involved in the Irish independence movement. What's most interesting about him was he had previously been a captain in the British Army. He was an imperialist. His father was one of the leading imperialist military figures in Britain. And he then had to deconstruct his own personality, everything he'd grown up with. So for an insider's view of trying to deconstruct colonization, it's a very, very interesting story. He's an incredibly contradictory character, and never settled down to a particular viewpoint. His autobiography, Misfit, is an amazing read, because it self-examines himself to a level that is really difficult to read, but never quite actually gets to the truth of what it is. But it's very interesting. He's a very interesting figure in that he had been involved, saw the reality of the colonies. He met the Kaiser, he met the king, he met all of these people, and what turned him against him was realizing that these people were definitely no better than anybody else, and there was no reason to hold them up at that level. Then became a Tolstoyan anarchist, hanging around and eating beets until he tired of beets, and then got involved in the Irish independence struggle. He founded the Irish Citizen Army. He drove an ambulance around Civil War Spain. Fascinating character, but really interesting deconstruction of the colonial structure, and actually how it was built on sand. It was never as big as and important as it thought it was, and the flaws were already starting to, at the beginning of the end was already there. But yeah, for an insider's view.
Do we have any groups, any of the anarchist groups here have got upcoming actions they want to announce or anything like that? Right. There's just a couple of quick notices. The European Christian Anarchist Conference is going to be happening in the middle of next month. It's happening in West London, so if you speak to the London Campus Worker Farm, they've got all the details on it. Top of that, there's that's the main action that I know that's of interest that should for anyone just now. Do keep an eye out on our website for any future events. We will have them regularly of every month. Please put your name on our Autonomy Now mailing list, so then you've got a notice about what else is coming up. Also, to just flag up another couple of books that we do here. We also do we also start anarchist studies, which is done mainly by academics around and around Loughborough University, and that's a relatively accessible anarchist journal. And then there's also the Contemporary Anarchist Studies journal as well. And I've had people in here, and although it's academic stuff, it was completely accessible. And if I think about the Contemporary Anarchist Studies one, the last person we had on doing a talk here on them, she was, I think she's from India originally, but she was doing a study of Scots in Amsterdam. So, and that was a cracking talk. So, I mean, things are happening, and just keep an eye out for all of the, check ourselves and see what's going on. And I just want to thank you all, and give it up for Donnacha, because that was a blinder. So we're not kicking out immediately, but if you could just give me a wee bit of room to